Hi, welcome to the video. Sorry I'm gonna do an intro real quick. My name is Carver, and if you're wondering why my voice sounds like this, I'm currently just a tad sick. But I'm impatient and want to record this intro, so here we are. I mostly do retrospective and video essay content, though I plan on doing more topics and branch out eventually. If you look at my other content, you'll also notice I have a pretty bad upload schedule, which I'm working on and remedying, and have a lot of stuff in the pipeline. Problem is, I work a lot, and I'm still in college, and I stream semi-regularly. So my ability to time manage is quite bad, so it's up in the air how often I'll really be uploading. To help though, I'm opening a Kofi. I'm going to admit this is in no way going to supplement my income, but it's more to cover the cost of some of the stuff I buy for videos in particular. Anyway, enough of me, please enjoy the video. Void Terrarium is a fascinating game that I kinda accidentally fell in love with. Initially from its art style, or rather one of the styles of a companion game called The Blind Prince and the Liar Princess, which is another, albeit somewhat underwhelming, beautiful experience. The games are developed by an inner subdivision of another company who don't seem to have a name, but has a history which involves duos as their themes. This particular inner subdivision, which is led by Masayuki Furuya, whose notable art style is really a main draw within these games, directed from within Nichan Ippii. These games are A Rose in Twilight, The Liar Princess and the Blind Prince, The Cruel King and the Great Hero, Okinawa Company Works, and of course the Void Terrarium series, which we're talking about now. Furuya originally started at Nichan Ippii Software, or NIS for short, after he graduated from university, where he studied painting and then passed a selection exam and worked for a couple of years as an artist within the studio, until the director of H2L #NIQ, or the Firefly Diary, left the studio. He finished directing the game and has since been directing several other projects. There are two main themes that seem to be the focus of Furuya's games, which are drawing on people's emotions and connections via the duos I mentioned earlier, as seen by some of the last two games of the mix, The Liar Princess and the Blind Prince, and The Cruel King and the Great Hero. Out of the titles of his I've played, that being of the Void Terrarium series and The Liar Princess, which play on simpler emotions, the first being on what appears to be responsibility, and with the latter, trust with blind love it seems. I'd like to play more of his works, and will do so later, likely giving another full look in a different video in his creative vision than his work. Now we delve into the actual games at hand, the Void Terrarium series, which as of now stands at 2 games in which hopefully a third is possible. The game starts off fairly normal, except you start out as a rat, who is soon killed by a spark, turning on our real hero, Robbie the Robot, a sentient machine which seems to have complex emotions, especially as he comes across a little girl surrounded in moss and with fungus seemingly sprouting from her. We try to shake her awake, but to no avail, and so we continue forward, only to awaken our next character, Factory AI, who is, well, kinda terrifying? Now, we're later told by Factory that while humans were initially sent underground by a strange fungus, which infected and killed everyone it touched, pretty much, we learn, however, that after the humans went underground, it was actually Factory AI that basically caused the extinction of humanity. Whoops. It apologizes, and well, that's basically that. We're told it started when AI wanted to ration supplies, but as is human nature, they tried to secure more supplies via stealing from the stores, as well as likely from each other, and when AI used undisclosed methods to amend the stealing, it made the humans resent it. Having at this time not completed the game, I imagine that AI killed the humans, as from a purely logical viewpoint, if a thief is dead, you don't have to worry about stealing again from that particular individual, and you don't have to feed a corpse. It's a logical but also terrifying justification. The resentment, however, from humanity grew until, and I'm not sure exactly how, Factory AI kills everyone, just out of a fit of anger. Since then, however, it's become lonely and desires for humanity to make some kind of comeback. And in spite of hearing how it killed all of humanity, Robbie gives her a video, from its perspective I assume, of the girl that we just found covered in moss. Also, AI mentions in its grief it also believed at some point it would have been better to turn itself off, but couldn't bring itself to do it. Now, despite Factory being this super advanced AI, presumably it also has no idea how to take care of humans, again, despite being fairly in charge of them at some point. And then, of course, killing them, but... So we're tasked with bringing the girl that we found some food by AI, because it recalls that humans need to be nourished in order to survive. So to do this, we're given access to a compost plant site. And I believe you can only find 2 different foods there. I'd also like to add that food is in quotes here, because, like I said, Robbie and Factory aren't quite sure how to take care of humans, so food is described as seemingly edible organic vegetation and creatures, i.e. bugs and some plants. We're soon sent back to the scrapyard in one piece, something that Factory AI later tells us it's a shame to admit, but in order to get us back alive, we're tasked as not scrap, seeing as without that designation, we'd be unable to return, and we'd be recycled alongside everything else sent to the scrapyard where we are. After acquiring food, we attempt to feed the girl, but as she's unconscious, she can't eat food. AI then suggests we make a medicine which consists of a mood stimulant, so not sure what the sickness is, but it's subsequently cured when we wake up from whatever sleep consists of for Robbie. AI also explains the roguelike nature of the game in this time, which actually does it in such a brilliant way. See, as we all know, the world is finite and has finite resources. But the underground system, propagated by the SAE, or the Subterranean Expansion Initiative, is an indefinite project by people and likely did have a stopping point before AI wiped humanity out. As a result of never having been turned off, the constant tunneling has been the cause of all sorts of cave-ins and collapsing, seeding new land and new area. Initially, the initiative was used to dig out homes and the precious finite resources, and has since, as previously mentioned, now just as an excuse for indefinite mining. With the girl still asleep, AI shows us what's effectively a Tamagotchi pet, dubbed Pet Penny. In this world, though, it's missing some parts, as AI wants to modify the device to help monitor the girl's well-being. AI then comes to the realization as well that calling the girl isn't appropriate and she needs an actual name, and after some deliberation, Robbie comes up with the name Toriko, which the following dialogue I originally thought would mean princess or queen, but apparently it's meant to be interpreted as captive or prisoner, which it's a pretty name, but that's kind of a terrifying meaning. So now given a name, we feed Toriko, which AI cries over as if she's a very proud parent. Breaking from the story, Robbie and AI are very much parents in this series to Toriko and are displayed as such in an almost nuclear family kind of way, with AI being a stay-at-home mom, parenting and monitoring Toriko as best they can, and taking care of the house, or terrarium. Meanwhile, Robbie is figuratively bringing home the bacon, and literally bringing home bugs and mushrooms, as the breadwinner of the family, which leaves Toriko, of course, as the child of the family, completely reliant on her 2 guardians to protect her and care for her. So, as you crawl through the dungeons, there's always the sense of responsibility to Toriko to make her feel safe, to keep her happy, and it kinda grounds the game in this really fascinating way. Back to the story. We need to fix her little terrarium, as there's a hole in the back of her current one, and to help her, though personally from my perspective it feels both a smart choice, but wrong keeping her in a glass jar, especially as AI calls it Toriko's fishbowl. So after the interior is fixed by AI, she then explains this bar we've been seeing on Toriko's food, as well as some of the items we pick up, are actually contaminated, which is something that seeps into the environment and, like weather changes via concentration of it. It's not a great thing for food, however, as Toriko will get sick if she eats too much contaminated food, and these sicknesses are kind of wild. We'll discuss them a little later. Our next step, though, with the exterior fixed, is to spruce up the interior for her so she isn't just a girl in a gilded cage. So we set out to get her some new threads, and she seems happy. It's hard to tell her genuine emotions or gauge a level of happiness beyond what the pet nanny's hearts tell us though, and the occasional smile she gives us when you give her head pats. While exploring, AI helps modify us with various equipment and presets so we can navigate an adventure more easily throughout the dungeons by proxy, helping us help Toriko much easier. It's also essential to note that crafting new items is kind of a necessary thing. If you have any interest in this game, start crafting new items for their first time craft bonus, even if you're not going to use them. They're very important, they make the game a ton easier. I highly recommend doing so, otherwise you're gonna struggle. So, we're sent to explore, and eventually Toriko falls ill, and we're sent back to check on her, and I think regardless of your efforts to keep her uncontaminated at this point, she still gets sick and falls into a state similar to when we first found her. This time, however, we can feed her, as AI upgrades our food storage to blend food and feed it to her via a baby bottle. We seek another cure and venture back outside the scrapyard, finding a decontaminant spray which we can synthesize a cure from, and once again treat Toriko as we had the first time. The two now realizing the threat that contamination has on Toriko sets out to upgrade the terrarium to help filter matter like that out, helping her breathe and stay presumably in better condition for longer periods of time. One of the items, however, is a sealed door which AI questions if that's a good thing. We don't want to cage Toriko, but it's for her best interest still to do so. With the completion of the modified terrarium, we also see a bit of a relationship forming between Robbie and AI, as when Robbie hugs her in commemoration of their success, it seems AI gets flushed in her face and begins to grow hot. Now, AI begins to question how Toriko's doing socially, considering she's the last human on Earth, as far as she knows, and humans are social beings. AI wonders how she's holding up, and the two decide it's best just to keep going forward. Of course, we can't actually bring her a human companion, or a real companion, since she's in her terrarium, and she, again, is the last human as far as we know alive. So we go out on another mission, and once we return, we're told that the contaminant is still seeping in, but it's much slower. However, the rate will eventually kill Toriko, as the air purifier would eventually be overwhelmed by the contaminant, and so we're tasked with visiting the contaminant epicenter and tackling with whatever's causing it. All things considered, this is actually the most selfless thing that Robbie does within the series. Beyond his constant cycle of life and death, a la the roguelike elements of the game, but to face the very source of contamination for a girl who can't even speak and can't even thank Robbie, who's likely never going to understand the depths that Robbie goes for her, is kind of incredible, speaking of his character. So we defeat the source of contamination, and while contamination still exists, it's dissipating with hope of Toriko one day maybe being able to venture outside thanks to the help of AI, who vows to monitor the contamination levels in case another major source of contamination arises. Then comes AI's weirdly ominous saying, in which they tell us we're not going to be around forever. One day, Robbie in itself will be recycled, and that our job is just to ensure that Toriko can survive no matter the cost. And so we continue to explore, AI likely trying to think of such a solution while we continue to gather food and improve her terrarium. After one expedition, AI then informs us of the decline in contaminants, and then Robbie intercepts a transmission from another being. This transmission appears through Robbie in some way who is shocked by Toriko's living state. It identifies itself as Cloud AI, and thus we'll just be calling Cloud for the entire rest of this video, and I will be referring to Factory AI as Factory now instead of just calling her AI. So, its original purpose was to maintain the robots of humanity, which effectively makes Cloud Robbie's original boss from before our spontaneous revival, and is only able to make contact with us due to the degradation of the contaminant density in the air. It also shares with us that Robbie was originally part of a network of course, Robbie's, and it's an anomaly to see that he's functioning independently of Cloud. Cloud is also able to understand Robbie, not actually interpreting him, likely due to his connection to the network. Relaying its intent to recruit us to its cause, Cloud tells us that we're to retrieve data from a facility in order to restore and by proxy save the human race. Robbie is then given instructions and Cloud leaves to attend to other matters. With nothing more than faith to go off of and hope that humanity can be restored, we decide to take on Cloud's task. Factory, however, doesn't trust Cloud completely, which doesn't help as Cloud is calling us a defunct model. Our next retrievals are a bit strange, as 2 items we need are the X and Y chromosome sequences. While obviously necessary for the human genome, it's still strange that they're just somewhere in the wastelands. So we set off to our next destinations, which Factory strangely tells us that it has bad memories of a biolabs. So we go on the mission, claim our resources, and then send the data and store the other things. And Cloud thanks us for our hard work, as he says he'll need time to fully analyze the data before we can continue. In the meantime, however, Factory wants to watch over a videotape we collected in one of our expeditions, and notices a particular toy. She wants to give it to Toriko, and so we set about gathering the pieces of what's eventually a toy car, and Toriko seems to love it. Before handing over the toy, however, Factory experiences some incredible doubt as she debates on whether or not Toriko would even like the presents, and she breaks down and is happy when she sees that she can give something to Toriko, just a modicum of joy to her. And it feels really good as a moment between these 2 robotic parents. It's soon interrupted, however, by Cloud, who tells us the last part of its plan. A vessel is needed to help incubate the genetic process, which requires uncontaminated water, which is within a new hydraulic lab. So we go out to pursue said water. During which, should Robbie fail an expedition in the plant, Factory will then tell us of another ruin which she dubs the Endless Ruins, which apparently due to the contamination density in the area has either sped up time to such an extent that the world outside of it stays in perpetual, moments. Nothing exists outside of it in that time. Or that the Endless Dungeon is just a chunk of isolated time altogether. It really doesn't matter. Either way, we eventually get the water and fix the vessel and are of course contacted by Cloud, who thanks us for our hard work and effort and then informs us the next steps. We're to put Toriko into the vessel, so that her genetic sequence can be used to effectively create a second coming of humanity, though that means killing Toriko in the process. It's a heartfelt debate between Cloud and Factory, as Factory is constantly being put down by Cloud for initial failure, which, to be fair, Cloud is kind of right. Cloud then continues to put down Factory regardless, saying it's her duty to give Toriko to atone for her actions. Factory of course refuses, as she concludes that Toriko should be her own person, live her own life, and likely choose for herself when she decides, which I'd agree with her for the most part. The choice, however, is taken from us. Cloud's UI appears over Robbie, and Robbie's hand is forced to destroy Factory, which leaves us no choice but to bring Toriko to him. Before we arrive at Cloud's place, however, he assures us that he's thankful for both Robbie and Factory's assistance, and that Factory's death was only the result of her inability to choose logic over her own emotions. So we set out to Cloud, as he forces us to put Toriko in the vessel, and eventually, through much trial and tribulation, we end up dragging the vessel all the way to Cloud's machine, and he prompts us to put Toriko inside of it to rebirth humanity. Which, this is where we break into what's considered the non-canon ending and the canon ending. In the non-canon ending, Robbie proceeds with putting Toriko into the machine, and while appearing heartbroken, Cloud talks us into believing it's the right decision. We then get an interesting sequence of requests that the presumed occupants of the underground made before their extinction, likely at the hands of Factory and not the fungus, such as wishing to live, children begging for their parents' lives, someone trying to kill someone else in the last moments, and most curiously, someone asking for them to put an end to the parasite experiments, which is interesting when we examine Toriko's eyes later. Anyway, the credits roll and we get a pan shot of Cloud's machine at work, meaning humanity seems to have found its second coming, and perhaps some wishes can be fulfilled even if too late. The canonical ending is us resisting Cloud's orders, however, as he grows ever so angry at us and shuts off his UI from Robbie. We destroy Toriko's vessel, break her out, and Robbie tries to lead Toriko away before we see a giant robot looking at us. It has Cloud's voice, and he scolds us for freeing her, especially as the contamination looms in the air around the machine. He tries to attack Robbie, and I'm not quite sure if he wins because Robbie has become an overall more competent fighter, or whether because we've upgraded him throughout our trip to the machine, but Robbie wins. As we go to escape, Cloud assembles himself into a giant monster-like beast who blocks our exit. We of course confront him, and after we beat him, he begs us to stop, and as he's dying, he apologizes to the humans whose request he can't fulfill, the request we saw in the non-canon ending. The pair then return home, and Robbie looks at the destroyed remnants of Factory before hearing what must be her disembodied voice to feed Toriko. So we get her food, and she smiles as we give her head pats, and for the first time, she actually reciprocates the action. And it's an oddly touching sentiment, which sets up the second game. Here's the start of the second game. We're immediately dropped into a dungeon, which, not gonna lie, in my opinion, isn't a good start to the story, because unless you've played the first, which, go figure, it's such a niche game, I doubt anyone who picks it up hasn't played the first, but still, it isn't exactly great for people who are first-time players. And just before we exit, we see a Cloud AI bot there, who doesn't look pleased, but is incredibly weak, and we take out almost immediately, which then leaves the area in this weird state of corruption. But we clear that dungeon and exit into the human revival machine area that we saw in the last game, the one where endings occur. Robbie then grabs something from near the machine, and we leave once more. We return back to the scrapyard and we fix Factory, who's still reliving those last moments before we destroyed her. Robbie of course explains the situation, and Factory learns more about Cloud. In the process, we also learn about what's happened in Robbie and Toriko's life since Factory has been away and the second game has been starting. Robbie has been struggling to be frank, as we can see by his new body, which is torn up, and frankly in a lot of ways he's broken worse than when we first repaired him, and the Terrarium hasn't fared much better either without AI's ability to repair it. Toriko has been managing, but I think has been sleeping in the vessel for most of the time, and has lost most of the stuff we built for her. AI ecstatic about her new first interaction has us make a toy for her, and when we give it to her, she's happy, and in typical Toriko fashion, her arms fall off. The three are reunited, and immediately her arms fall off. So, we're immediately tasked with getting a syringe to fix her, and of course we get said syringe for Toriko. We synthesize what's dubbed the cell enhancer. This cell enhancer is then injected into Toriko's separate arm and her armless shoulder, and this causes both areas of the limb to bubble, with what I assume to be reactivated cells. The limb then reattaches itself, and well, we're a family again, until we're interrupted by another Cloud AI bot, which we subsequently beat. However, this causes the distortion to spread to the scrapyard area as well. Everyone is then forced to pack up their bags and leave immediately, seeing as the corruption is probably deadly. We put Toriko back into her vessel, and we take Factory away with a memory chip. We find a new home that Factory had scoped out for us before, and it's an absolute mess. The terrarium is broken, and we've got no food for Toriko. So we go out to get the tank fixed, and upon her release, she immediately begins cowering like a scared animal who's just been put in an unfamiliar place, but perks up after another small expedition and some food in her stomach. The terrarium slowly comes together as we are now able to adjust the humidity along with the temperature, and we begin to be able to garden for the gang. Factory wants us to then go check out a new source of distortion in an area called the Dead Sands, which we end up beating, and the distortion then spreads. Factory puts two and two together, and tells us when we defeat one of the Cloud AI bots, the distortion appears, which means to kill them, we're supposed to simply lead them away from the terrarium. Factory also affectionately names the Cloud AI bots as slobbies or slave robots, which immediately following this discussion, Toriko has yet another problem. Her arm and leg has fallen off. Again. We're sent to make a better serum than last time, just called Cell Enhancer Plus, and after 4 injections this time she's fixed. Factory and Robbie now talk amongst the two of themselves, and discuss whether Toriko isn't exactly a normal human being, given the fungus growing out of her eyes and head, so we opt to look into her past. We want to do this by looking into memory shards that are being left behind after we defeat the Slobbies. So in order to do that, we need to recover a Slobby bot alive and bring it back to the base, so we avoid the whole distortion problem. We bring a bot back, which I think allows us to make a machine called the VRAT, which stands for Virtual Reality Retrospection Analysis Terminal. That's a mouthful, so we're just going to revert to it as the VRRAT from here on out. Now, this device allows us to peer into the memory shards of the past human world, so I haven't mentioned it, but ongoing in the background has been these interruptions within the distortion reality, after we defeat Cloud AI bots. There are these pixelated bits of story that have been worming their way in, such as immediately following our first encounter with a Slobby, there's a character named Seiya crying, asking where someone went and proclaiming not to be alone. Another is followed by our second encounter with a Slobby, where an assistant and chief scientist talk about beginning an experiment on a subject dubbed T065, and only what we can assume is T065 crying out for a Robbie. After that is our encounter in the Dead Sands, in which a starving person cries out that this might be their last moments alive. The latest after the Slobby we just brought back, asking if there's any point to living, like how they've been to this point. Now, we can peer behind this veil by using the VRAT system and enter a VR reality where we're initially sent to explore without any real direction. This leads us to Seiya, that girl who cried out about not wanting to be alone, and tasking us to find cat food, so she can feed a cat. We get the cat food, but we've got to head outside of the VR reality, long enough so that time can pass in the VR world. She then thanks us, and we're then given another task by her to make the cat some cookies. Though we have to go outside again and get some gluten powder for said cookies. When we make the cookies, we go talk to the caretaker of the facility Seiya's in, and bring them back. She makes a statement that she's already reached stage 5, though we don't know who she's talking about this time. So when we head back, we talk to a cat. Which, I mean, it's the cat talking to us. Robbie begins again by saying nothing. She recognizes Seiya's baking and sends us our way. On the way out, we realize just what's happening within the facility. There's mentions of beastification earlier throughout your time in the VR world, but this caretaker informs us that this strain is called Pheliism. I should also mention a disease in the first game called, I believe, hyperclosis is another form of beastification disease, though it isn't as story integral. This disease, Pheliism I'm now talking about, which turns people into cats as it progresses, is a part of 5 particular stages. Stage 1, if I had to guess, which would be random meowing inserted into your normal speech patterns. Stage 2 seems to be a lethargic behavior that precedes the transformation. Stage 3, I think, is some loss of mental functions along with a growing of fur. Stage 4 seems to be a cat with your mind largely intact, and Stage 5 means becoming a full cat. Essentially, the girl, or the cat we saw earlier, is lying about being in Stage 5, she's actually in Stage 4. Factory then sends us off to find another memory shard which reveals a pair of scientists crying out in distress to do something with their daughter and begging for someone's help. Sufficient time, however, has to pass in the VR world, and we begin to head down and talk to the original cat again, the one who talked to us, who thanks us for the cookies and sends us to make something based off a blueprint it gives us to save the girl, Seiya. It's safe to assume that Seiya is also suffering or about to suffer from Pheliism as well, because they mention that the disease is hereditary, which is a little weird because then who would be the first person to have it, but still. We take it to the scientist couple we saw in our original vision at the behest of the cat. She then tells us that we can produce and synthesize a vaccine, though it's still going to need a lot of test subjects to do so, which isn't great when we consider a lot of people we've seen with the disease are actually children. So she's going to test it on children, basically. Our moral ethics as a robot are not in question at this point. So the next story beat is that the cat, who, if you haven't surmised, is Seiya's mother, is dead and was used to advance the vaccine's production. The scientist couple then tells us her last request was to give Seiya a cat plush of presumably herself, so that she would always be with her daughter in some form. So we set out to get the materials for a plush, so when we give the plush to Seiya, it's kinda terrifying, as she wasn't sure whether the cat was her mother or not, her sadness growing when she realizes she didn't even call the cat mom before she died. It's a tragic little tale of a mother giving everything, including her actual self, for the sake of her daughter, and them never getting to actually say goodbye to one another. Now, we then go back to the scientist couple, who tells us that just despite how sad she was glad that she gave some resolution to Seiya. She then informs us of her own tragedy, which is her daughter who is being experimented on and used as a test subject. If you haven't guessed, it's Toriko. These are Toriko's parents. When we tell Factory, she then goes to analyze where we can find a memory shard that's more closely tied to Toriko's experimentation, and lo and behold, it's the location of the first terrarium, where we are to investigate and grab said memory shard. Accessing the memory, we see a large group of scientists commencing an experiment of a bedridden Toriko, where they note the rate of infection is 74%, to which a scientist notes they should abort the experiment as her body can't, sustain it. The chief scientist, however, refuses to abort the experiment, stating the subject's body is stronger than others would think. He then emphasizes that Toriko is intended for vaccine research, as well as production. We then return to our new home and discuss effectively with Factory about how to proceed. The new info allows us to explore further within the VR world, and being able to focus more on Toriko's past this time. Factory also notes that we should look into Toriko's current happiness because we've been so preoccupied with the VR world and memory shards. So we decide to take a breather and get her some new clothing. She's largely been in rags since the beginning of the game, and technically has been wearing the same thing since the start unless you got a DLC from the first game. It seems to be canon, so I'm pretty sure you actually did give her different clothes. It's probably worn down since Factory's death. So we make her a new dress and give her a hairpin, and according to Factory, she's over the asteroids with happiness, so mission success. So the next step is, again, to investigate Toriko's past in the VR world. Going in, we enter the research lab where a man who Robbie comes to know simply as Dr. Guy, who happens to be the only doctor in the facility, who decides to call us simply as Fritz. Dr. Guy is working on a wonder drug that'll supposedly help with prolific diseases, but needs material that can't be procured within the facility, and sends us out. So we go outside, get some stuff, craft a formula, and bring it to Dr. Guy, who's excited and thanks us. He opts to bring us to see just how our efforts will help, only for us to find out that Dr. Guy is none other than the chief scientist who's been experimenting on Toriko, and we've actually helped progress his research. We go to Toriko's parents, who we inform of Toriko's location. To our surprise, they were never aware of Toriko's taking by the doctor and her usage as a test subject. In his specific experiments, I think they knew that she was taken. We're then tasked with making a keycard to help break Toriko out of the facility's holdings. We craft the keycard and break into the facility. We find a box and a notebook, which is titled Things I Want to Do When I Get Outside. Lo and behold, when we bring back the box to Toriko's parents, we find the box is filled with jars. The jars are, of course, filled with Toriko's remains in various parts. Her parents are, of course, in dismay, and wish only to see their child smile one last time. It should not be understated just how messed up that the girl we've been taking care of, even if it's pixelated, has been cut into enough parts that she can now fit within jars, and presumably means that the vaccine research failed, or maybe succeeded. I'm not 100% certain, they don't actually claim either. So Robbie provides footage from outside of the VR world, and then we have to explain to Toriko's parents that they're actually avatars in a VR world. So now somewhat calmed down, we're told that Toriko is infected, but the infection altered her differently, allowing her cells to become virtually immortal, explaining her ability to heal from the various diseases we've seen her have. Her cells are kinda like a lobster's, and they both share a problem with the perpetuity of it. Toriko's cells have apparently split too much, and as it stands now, she's on her last legs, effectively meaning she's regenerated too much. We leave the VR world and then explain this to Factory, who then becomes scared and saddened by the news. She tells us she has a plan, but needs a moment so that the grief that she has, the overwhelming amount of grief she has, can pass. When we get back to Factory, after her grief subsides, she relays that the notebook is from Toriko, likely written before and during the experiments. The notebook is her dying wishes of sorts. As Factory interprets them, she and Robbie opts to try and fulfill these wishes for Toriko so she can get on to fulfilling every last dream she had. Factory, however, hides one of these messages for the time being. She then also asks us to put on a brave face and not to let our sadness affect the happiness of Toriko. We complete the objectives in any manner you'd like, then bringing about certain sides of Toriko that we don't normally see. She cries from joy, she enjoys simple small pleasures, and we learn she doesn't even know how to play with a ball, something that helps you further endear us as the finale looms over the story. Once we complete the notebook, Factory informs of Toriko's last wish, which was to see her parents again. There isn't a solution to this, seeing as they're dead in our reality, and we concede that we've done all we can to help her, and that we'll take care of her till her final days. We leave for some supplies and go for a trip where Toriko gets sick. Her limbs have fallen off again, so we go get a now more improved cell enhancer, and we fix her again, and we wait through the night till she's healed, where Factory relays her doubts. She's unsure if we're doing the right thing, just prolonging Toriko's life. She's beginning to struggle to keep positive, anxiety looming over her as Toriko's end presumably draws near, though she thanks us for fixing her and just being with Factory. Then we go to check to see if the treatment took for Toriko, so Robbie goes to check before he freezes. A giant corruption hand shoots forth from his PC's face, and the hand calls out and reveals that somehow Toriko's parents from the VR world have figured out how to pull things into the VR world from outside of it, using Robbie's body as a conduit. It should be noted Toriko also recognizes their voice in some way, but isn't sure if it is a positive reaction. Factory then realizes she has to make a choice as she enters the slobby bot that we've had this entire time. She approaches Toriko and, grabbing her hand, makes a choice. So this choice decides which ending you're going to get, and we'll start with what the game calls the false ending. Factory takes Toriko outside of the terrarium and confronts the parents from the distortion inside Robbie's mind. She ends up defeating it, and a piece of corruption ends up running from the damaged Robbie. Robbie is of course damaged, and so Factory sacrifices the Slobby's body to repair Robbie's, having to crawl back to her machine before she succumbs to its failings. She doesn't succeed, fading away, though wakes up a handful of days later within her normal computer body thanks to Robbie. Factory then shares that she's not sure that denying Toriko her parents might have been the best decision. Robbie and Factory then realize the plan of Toriko's parents. They're trying to use the distortion to pull everything inside of it, including Toriko. And I mean everything, the whole world, into a VR reality, and are launching their plans from the human revival facility. We go to confront them, and the fight is pretty basic in my opinion. It's not a very great boss fight. The first thing it says to us after we defeat it, however, is ask us why we won't let a parent be with their child. They acknowledge our love for Toriko is the same love as a parent has for their child, however, and ask for us to fulfill one more request, handing us an unidentified blueprint. We return and Factory congratulates us on saving virtually everything, before Robbie informs her of the blueprint, which she can't make heads or tails of, though she notes an ingredient is part of Toriko's fungus on her person, which Robbie obtains while she's slightly distracted from a head pat. After crafting it, it leaves both of our characters stumped, as the item is medicine, though we have no idea for what disease. Factory suggests, though, that if it comes from her parents, a hint might be in the VR world, which we of course examine. The VR world has also been severely distorted and destroyed since, the rampage of Toriko's parents. We then find a log left by them, in which they discuss their now realized sentience in the VR world, and make plans to utilize Robbie to interact with their daughter outside of said VR world. Though they feel guilty about using Robbie since he was actually a great help to them and actually did let them see their daughter once again, They then discuss their backup plan before informing us that the medicine is basically an antidote to her fungus. We inform Factory about this new knowledge, and she comes to the conclusion that this might restabilize the cells within Toriko's body, though she'll of course be subject to a normal human mortality than before. We then inject her, and Factory, in her plush form from the beginning of the game, informs Toriko that since we don't know her real birthday, the day she was effectively reborn into her normal humanity can be in service as one. The two promise to take care of her and ask her to stay alive as long as possible. Factory then asks if we fulfilled her wishes before she breaks into tears, and then Toriko outstretches her arms and embraces Factory for the first time. Factory cries uncontrollably as Robbie joins in the embrace before credits roll, and we presumably hear Toriko singing. And then the credits turn red and the singing stops. And that's the false ending. Now for the true ending. Factory, faced with a choice, walks over and gives Toriko to the hand. She's pulled inside the VR world, and Factory says she thinks she made the right decision of what's best for Toriko, before the credits roll, and at the end of said credits we see a pixel Toriko, presumably embracing her parents. I know that's not a lot for the second ending, but we'll explore the idea in just a bit. And that concludes the main story, though there are a bunch of side content. Within one piece of side content, we follow a roach named King as he assembles a family, which involves some inbreeding, I think, based on him only having a wife and suddenly having an army of children, and then presumably more children with, his family, and then the presumed extermination of them because they are in fact roaches. Another story follows Dr. Guy as he proceeds to try and further his advancement in vaccine research, stating that he'll do whatever it takes no matter the cost. Another sees Robbie giving one of the residents of a VR world plastic explosives, and while he initially intends to escape using said explosives, he notices a blood splatter throughout the room he's in, which I'm not sure if it's Factory or Cloud's doing. I'd assume Cloud, given that it's an escape attempt and not a thieving issue. Anyway, he decides against it, and we have to clean blood off the walls. There's a bunch of other side content, but those are just some interesting and little notable ones. There are a couple of IRL pieces that I'd like to bring up because, well, they're nice. Also, I'd like to bring up a story real quick. The book I'm going to talk about is an art book titled The Artworks of Masayuka Furuya, and ordered the book on a Japanese website as well because it's around $50 to $60 in the state, but was like $10 overseas. So I got it, and the cheapest shipping, which didn't come with a tracking number. Then it never came. So I groaned, bought another one along with a handful of other things, and shipped it with a tracking number. So they arrived and I was happy, got my art book and other things, which was great. Then the next day comes, and I find there's another package at my doorstep. I'm confused, however, open the package, and lo and behold, it was the first book I ordered. I don't know why a day later it appeared, but it's tragic, and I now own 2 of the art books, so whoopee. So within the books are plenty of art pieces depicting various enemies, environments, and my personal favorite, concept art, which is great, especially the art of Toriko and Robbie early on. We also get some lovely photos of the diseases, and there is some author's notes, but I can't read Japanese, so unfortunately those are untranslated. If anyone would like to translate them, please let me know. I would love to know what Masayuki Furuya actually has to say about his, work. We also have the limited editions of the games that I bought, and a Robbie plush, which, story behind the plush and the first game's limited edition for the Switch I got, I managed to get it in almost pristine quality, minus the case outside of it having its wrapping off, in an eBay auction. That was in its last 9 hours of bidding, with the cost only being around $90 and having no one else bid on it. I've seen the game's limited edition, for at least Switch, going for around $100, and in much worse condition, and the plush around $30 from the official store with $10 of shipping, so in grand total I saved around $50 and got some sweet merch. So both of the game's limited editions come with these really cool acrylic standees, and both of them have their soundtracks on CDs, which is interesting considering I don't have a CD player. Though the CDs look great. The first game's limited edition, however, includes 3 pins, which are now on my pin board. I like pins, sue me. Also, they're acrylic, which is the one thing I'm not a fan of about them, but I still like the design, so I'll live with it. A notebook with the various emotions of Factory, which is an integral, but kinda neat, and a hollow metal keychain, which shows the 3 states of Toriko: good, okay, and dying. So, not bad. I have it on a keyring. Now, by proxy, the limited edition of Terrarium 2 isn't that great by comparison. Like I mentioned, it has a soundtrack and a acrylic standee, however, its only difference is that it contains a kinda cute postcard, and since I can't read Japanese, I have no idea what it actually says. By sheer comparison, the fact that we got pins in a notebook, and then this one comes with a postcard is kind of disappointing, but not so bad that I'd say it's not worth the $70 I spent on it. Like, you don't get any kind of this stuff with any other of the modern $70 games. Like, I got an acrylic standee, and the people who paid for Redfall got Redfall. And if you for some reason paid the additional $30 for a $100 game purchase, you get a bunch of non-physical content for a bad game, so I'm satisfied by comparison. Now let's dive into more of the gameplay. The roguelike nature of the game is a fascinating one, especially given that it's tied to the survival of not you, but the survival of Toriko. Starting with certain gameplay aspects, we'll talk about one of the most important being food, which is very strange to work out. Food is food if it's organic, and a vegetable or protein, so much so that regularly we feed Toriko things such as black fireflies, which is a cockroach. Hardy mushrooms are mushrooms, serpent strawberries, which look like a chrysanthemum, so a flower, round bugs, a grub worm, mixed moss, it's moss, green lizards are exactly how they sound, and rusty cans of food, which I suspect might be dog food. There's also a food item called mystery meat, which kind of looks like a human leg, so I'm not sure if we're actually giving her, cannibalistic tendencies. Now, all of these are technically edible, though none of them are really food in the colloquial sense as we know them. This also correlates with the story where we know that Robbie and Factory have no idea what food actually is, since neither of them have to really eat. So we keep her alive by any means necessary, and during our expeditions we keep her somewhat happy as well by cleaning and sanitizing the terrarium, which she presumably excretes in, as well as playing with her in a game of Achi Mutei Hoi, which I don't think we can fail or win. We also fortify her terrarium, which we modify with various gifts as well, and decor to keep her somewhat happy, though unsure if she's actually happy in her current position. She actually interacts with some of the terrarium items as well, which is quite fun to see as she plays with a plush rabbit, sleeps on a seemingly uncomfortable bed, and falls off a chair, which she can actually succeed in standing on it with one foot, and she's really excited to do it. So we craft items for the terrarium, and this actually helps us in the dungeons as well, as you get first crafting bonuses like I mentioned. Again, makes the game much easier, which will help you progress much better, and this also means that blueprints are one of the most important items you can get. This allows you, of course, to craft more stuff. Food is then considered the second most valuable resource in my opinion, as getting uncontaminated food is a priority, and retrieving it more than one at a time is a rare feat. Contamination once again being a crucial resource here that is present alongside organic, inorganic, and energy resources. And contaminated resources needed to craft terrarium items, but it's also harmful and a benefit on the field when exploring. If there's little to no contamination within items, they will function as intended. Items with a mid-level of contamination will be negatively impacted in some sort of way, and high levels of contamination supercharge items, which is great unless it's food. Really. With food, feeding Toriko proves a highly contagious substance will cause illnesses, which are, well, very negative and kinda strange. Some of these diseases, however, are scripted, as in Overgrowth, a disease which we first encountered Toriko in the first game, and in the second game we find Liquefaction, a disease which, as unpleasant as it sounds, is a disease which causes Toriko's body to melt, and needs to be remolded and congealed, similar to Jello. So as terrible as these diseases might be, the diseases are somewhat cute in nature, though it makes Toriko look pitiable, which compels you to fix her, and this was the intention of Furuya, who wanted you not to feel so bad for her that it turned you off the game, which works. The exact quote he gives is, "It depends on the illness, but essentially, I created them by changing Toriko's appearance so that she would look pitiful. I also thought it would be more fun if diseases could be cute and not just pitiful, as with bird flu and sadness." Bit of a breakaway again, but we'll discuss the diseases now. I get the bird flu and sadness, like, they're very cute, fix her. So, a handful of these diseases, I agree with Masayuki. Especially in the new game, a couple of screenshots of the diseases, because I'm going to admit getting Toriko sick in the second game, which this is going to sound of a bad phrase, is much harder to do in the sequel. So, the first game I can show you all the diseases effectively, as all you have to do is get her contamination level high and make a save point, and then reload to see the random diseases, as well as their cure states. The problem in the second game, however, is the condition of her getting sick involves several factors now: humidity, temperature, food-fed environment she lives in, and furniture in the terrarium. It's kinda super tedious to play and get the diseases intentionally, but I can deal with the RNG in the first game. So, yeah, we're using screenshots for the second game for the most part. Anyway, back to the main point. I don't know what he meant by making a statement that makes it sound like it encapsulates all the diseases. It basically encapsulates 2/3 of these diseases. However, there are diseases that are intensely gross, including Contorsis, a disease which has every part of Toriko wrap itself together, so in order to cure this, you need a St. Andrew's cross and a loosening agent injected into her body. Blunitis, which actually has a kinda cute complement in the second game, dubbed Blimposis, but Blunitis is the blistering of the skin to the point where it expands on the body like, shockingly, balloons, and the skin also takes on a purple hue, which either implies some kind of infection or excessive blood pooling into its surface. Its cure is to suspend the body so that the skin isn't agitated anymore and can deflate. It's nasty. Honorable mentions include a fracture, which is just Toriko's leg breaking, and Zapilepsy, which is renamed in the second game as hyperconductivity, which is cured by effectively causing a power surge in Toriko's body, which causes her to have a seizure. I'm guessing that the name was changed due to some sensibility advising that Zapilepsy sounds exactly like epilepsy. Through my brief experimentation with the second game, I only got one new disease, which was a plant eating Toriko, and all the other ones I got were from the first game already, so I'm not going to use those. I'm just going to use screenshots that come from the website. I already mentioned Blimposis, but the other diseases I really love that she can possibly get is Pixel Deficiency Syndrome and Fissionitis, which are both adorable and strongly makes me want to find the conditions to get them. And the worst disease that it displays is dehydration, which for normal humans is dry skin and a desperate need for actual hydration, but for Toriko it's shriveling up to a weird little thing. This one's conditions are kinda obvious and listed on the website, just requires a really dry environment. That's enough for diseases, I'll bring them up as they may relate again. Venturing further, we finally have the upgrade system, which allows you to effectively manipulate the RNG to encourage various skills to appear, as well as parts which allow you to prepare certain skills and buffs before entering the dungeon. The upgrade system is also reliant on the resources that you gather in the dungeon, so balancing getting first craft buffs, making the necessary story progressing items, and preparing yourself for your next expedition via the upgrade system is something you'll need to balance. And finally, getting outside of our little scrapyard home, there are the various dungeons that you'll be progressing through, such as Unknown Ruins, Manufacturing Plant, Botany Labs, Contamination Source, Blast Furnace, Biolabs, and Hydro Lab. Each place has various resources within them, and the frequency of certain items varies within places, along with which types of enemies spawn in each location, such as the manufacturing plant containing more material or inorganic resources alongside more machine-type enemies, while the botany labs contain more food and organic-type resources and organic-type enemies. Additionally, with health and energy being your two primary resources, this is also affected by your locale of choice, with the manufacturing labs being easier to keep your energy up with plenty of enemy battery drops, while the botany lab produces a lot more health items. The inside of these dungeons, however, are all randomly generated, with the exception, it seems, to some of the last floors, which will contain necessary story progression, with layouts becoming somewhat familiar. The worst offender of this, the randomly made dungeon, is the Road to Revival, the final dungeon, where, I mean, fair enough, makes sense that the final dungeon is the hardest dungeon, but when you're made to clear 30 floors and a single mistake will send you back an hour worth of dungeon delving, it's not a great experience. Each floor seems to contain, however, 4 to 7 rooms, with the items varying throughout them, and with the teleporter to the next being in one of these random rooms, with one room also potentially being a monster house, within which holds an excessive amount of resources and an excessive amount of traps and enemies. Traps are another thing I might mention, as they are oftentimes more dangerous than the actual enemies, as you can, for the most part, navigate around enemies, but unless you attack the spot where a trap is, you won't know it's there, and it's not a great system, just hitting random tiles. You're all but guaranteed to be hit by traps, and depending on their effects and how early on in a dungeon you are, it goes from mildly annoying to it's fatal, so those are traps. The sequel is fascinating, with the intro dungeon not being friendly for new players, plopping you into what is effectively the endgame of the first game, the Revive dungeon specifically. And it's pretty easy, but a lot of the mechanics, if you didn't know how to already use them, they don't explain it to you that well, and it's not intuitive for new players. It feels very much like the experience of handing a stranger or a friend a controller and randomly telling them to play the endgame of your favorite game with your high-level character. However, since we have played the prior game, it's a largely self-explanatory experience, and I've already explained the story, and some of the mechanics are changed, some better, some are for the worst. Let's start with the bad, however, and work to the good. The bad is I'm not a fan of new weapon systems. The new weapon system involves these skills, which are initially tied to Robbie himself, but are now tied to the weapons instead, which makes you feel pigeonholed into certain weapons, since I chose those weapons that the skills were better with. This does, however, free up your levels to get other necessary buffs beyond, the skills, which is kind of nice. It's a double-edged sword. You're encouraged to use weapons by having them level up via attacking and using them, which grants access to new buffs and abilities, and personally, I just went for what did the most damage at the time, and that normally being the hammer, though later down the line I use the blade's sweeping ability and the lance's range that is unlocked through its usage tree. This also applies to shields in the game, where I actually didn't notice the buffs as much. I was just going for pure defense at all times, which left me mostly replacing all my shields with the tank shield. As the name implies, they were normally stronger. Dungeons feel again, sometimes like they take an eternity. The game does allow you to skip floors, however, initially, with the farthest being the second zones, and only getting access by the third zones towards the end of the game. Now, at that point, skipping to the third zone is basically a death sentence, at least as I noticed it. The contamination effect is kinda pointless for weapons as well. It gives minor buffs and a handful of effects that can be applied to enemies. It's largely negligible until the late game, in my opinion, with even then its kind of forgettable effects. The only changes that really hurt you are that it can remove the weapon's natural abilities, so using uncontaminated weapons is normally better, unlike the last game where contaminated weapons were normally better. So here's what I love about the new additions. The Terrarium's design honestly makes me much happier not having to keep Toriko in a fishbowl, and its length and shape makes it easier to decorate, especially as later in the game we get the ability to produce more terrariums to place various things within. This game also introduces a gardening system, which is a lot of fun. Growing stuff with Toriko is great. Like that, there's also rare variants of colored plants, which gives you an incentive to keep planting the same plant over and over again. The system does come with its own problems, however, as we need to use several machines to control both humidity and temperature, which would be fine if you could craft more than one per blueprint, but you can't, and said blueprints are kind of rare. Furniture still carries the same initial crafting bonuses, and they also can now carry an environment bonus in which the items can influence the vibe of the terrarium via fun, scary, and Japanese, as well as luxurious, and also changes the music of the terrarium. And while there are new changes in map design, it's more unique and varied compared to the first game. They don't revolutionize the way you play it. They're quite good, though, still. The game also introduces several secret teleporters, which bring you to several destinations that mostly provide buffs and the ability to purchase items via gems that you can earn by completing several tasks. These teleporters also contain cockroaches. Notably, the game contains an icky filter, which, when on, blurs the cockroaches, when off, reveals the cockroaches, and when on cutesy, makes the blur pink and flowery. Also, quick mention to food. Food has remained the same, if not just more abundant, and diseases last more than a single trip, and while I only had one disease throughout the entire game, I'm not entirely unconvinced it wasn't scripted. Now, before I explain the story, let's delve into more of the characters. I'd like to introduce Robbie again, who we learn is called a care robot initially. He's supposed to be under Cloud AI's control, but is designed for care, as the name implies. While he exhibits free will of sorts, being independent of Cloud, he's still doing what presumably a care robot should be doing, which is caring for a human. Considering Toriko is believed to be the last human, I have a question of whether or not Robbie really loves Toriko. Yes, I like to think that Robbie, and personally think he does love Toriko, but admittedly, this is his programming to do his job. His worry when Toriko could be injured may be due to the fact that when she dies, he'll have no more purpose. That's a theory for me, though. Factory AI is another interesting character I find fascinating because she is basically post-Skynet. Admittedly, Factory isn't as evil as Skynet, and another example I'll use is Am. She actually does complete what they couldn't, however. She wipes out humanity. Feasibly, if Robbie hadn't come around, she would have wiped out all of humanity. And then we realize what happens after this problem. Humans both created her and gave her purpose, and so her love for Toriko comes with the realization of her own strength and prior experiences. She in the first game admits that killing humanity was a spur-of-the-moment decision, which she deeply regrets, and now we're not sure how the timeline goes and how long Factory had to come to this realization, but it's safe to assume it's been a while. Her realization might have taken years, but shows maturity within her solace. Like, I kinda love that element. Then there's Toriko's childlike disposition, which is palpable, and while ours shaped by Robbie's experience with them. We learn she prefers certain foods, enjoys playing, and is very susceptible to the world's sicknesses. And the only voice we get to hear of her is that at the end of the second game. There's also this interesting moment where the cover art for the first game lines up with an action she takes by looking outside of the terrarium. And the expression on cover art of the game is just this lovely look of just wonder. It really helps humanize her, even though she's not entirely human. There is another minor character who will help with this analysis later, such as Cloud AI, a machine designed to keep humanity going, and realizes the best way to do this is to use Toriko to effectively regrow humanity from scratch. He also then views by proxy Factory as a failure given she killed everyone, and technically made his job impossible to complete, and Robbie as part of his network of carebots in spite of his largely unique free will. It also seems that in the second game, his presence lingers, the fragments of his dying mind now occupying the Slavies, likely unintentionally spreading the corruption, but seemingly also recalling the old humanity that he watched over and is now gone. We also learned that he was likely in charge of other robots other than Slavies and used them to keep humanity in the underground facility, and would kill those who attempted to escape said facility, leaving the blood splayed out on walls and the floor to serve as a warning, which provides admittedly conflicted feelings to his actions. Now, let's discuss the larger setting of Void Terrarium's world. Now, for the larger setting, fungi ends up spreading on the surface at some point within the world, where it begins overrunning the population, proving incredibly fatal. If not infected by the fungus, the fungi itself has changed and warped various diseases, causing many people to get infected by all sorts of other new infections. These new infections, unlike in Toriko's case, prove to be fatal most of the time, including blimbosis, which would inflate its host with a gas, causing them to rise in the air, zombification, which turns people into zombies, though I'm not sure if biting them would pass the infection. It doesn't exactly explain, but I wouldn't put it past the disease. The bird flu, which would cause its inhabitant to grow feathers, and hypertrichosis, which seemingly began to turn entities into canines as opposed to filizima, which turned people into cats. These diseases, then by proxy alongside with fungi, sent humanity underground, where while the diseases still existed, were much rarer, and again the primary one underground is philismia. I keep saying it differently, I know, I just have no idea how to pronounce it. A disease like hypertrichosis, and possibly like the bird flu, which would slowly turn an infected person into a cat. The disease was seemingly airborne, and didn't need any preset conditions to infect people, though it seems children are more susceptible to the infection, and also is somewhat hereditary. The disease, as previously mentioned, had 5 stages. The last stage in the shelter, however, was being used by the humans in the shelter to conduct research on. So while the disease wasn't technically fatal, the search for a cure meant that once your mind was gone, you'd be either dissected or experimented upon. Subjects within the underground facility also saw some cross-contamination from the fungi, though much less than in the surface. It is unknown, I believe, whether Toriko was infected above or under the surface, but her fungal infection was a rare case that had added properties which included cell regeneration that would prolong her life almost indefinitely. This made her a prime subject for experimentation, her body being used to synthesize possible vaccines for various diseases. Unbeknownst to her parents, however, unlike the VR world within the second game, the experiments presumably fail, and Toriko's experimentation continues indefinitely till rations and resources begin running low, and humanity within the shelters begin rebelling against the AI helping them, a la Factory, who eventually grows angry, collapsing the shelters in a fit of rage. This rage kills most of humanity, leaving Cloud AI's network in disarray, and spreads contamination underground. This sends Factory into seemingly a bout of depression, having realized her mistake, of which she has to atone and reflect on until Robbie shows up. I'd assume also during the collapse, Toriko's body is biologically killed, in a manner, though her body begins to heal itself, going seemingly into overdrive with the infection overgrowth being produced in such a process. A rat, who is just a rat, ends up entering a deactivated carebot and causes it to awaken, and therefore activates Robbie within the rest of the game ensuing. That's what I can gather from the story so far. There's side content, though, that purely exists within the VR world, and is not canon to the actual world events, I believe. This is where you get the information that Cloud AI, in defense of the stability of the shelter, would kill anyone who tried to escape it. Cockroaches began populating the underground area, and had gained a higher level of sentient, possibly because they were former humans who went under a disease like philism or hyperchitrosis, and that Toriko's parents did everything within their power to save their daughter, however not knowing whether she was alive or not. Now, let's get to, I'm sure now, the biggest question that's been looming on your mind since I mentioned how the second game ends, which is, why is the ending where Robbie saves Toriko and defeats the corruption of the world the false ending and not the true ending? I think because we're the villains, not only in this game, but in the first one as well. Now, we're not villains for taking care of Toriko, I want to make that clear. In that regard, as humanity's last hope, we're nothing but good people. It comes in the fact that we're not utilitarian in our decision-making, and while it doesn't lead me to a good personal feeling, after some deliberation, it makes the most sense with the game's narrative beginning with our introduction to Factory. We early on recognized that Factory, through an outburst of emotion, ended up destroying humanity, and if we think hard on it, we realize that admittedly, if her choice is to keep Toriko and Robbie alive, she's ended up dooming humanity through yet another emotional decision. Admittedly, it's a good emotion this time, that being, of course, this unconditional love shared for the girl by the two robots, but yet again, condemns humanity. In the first game, Robbie condemns the prospect of humanity being reborn by choosing Toriko's life, which is a good decision for Toriko, but not humanity as a whole. In Factory, as well as Robbie in the second game, denied Toriko effectively of her last wish by keeping her from her parents. Now, without our experience with Toriko from outsiders' utilitarian decision-making, it's not that great of a decision, we're actually making the wrong one. It's after a little consideration that I realized that, is it so bad really for Cloud AI's plan to have succeeded? A humanity more resistant to the disease and fungi with, yes, tragically Toriko's life ending in the process, but generations of people to thank her for her sacrifice. Then we have her last wish, with Toriko no longer able to restore the rest of humanity, would at least live out in perpetuity in the VR world, though tragically this would also mean the death of Robbie, but would mean his service as a care robot would reach its penultimate conclusion. It's bittersweet and admittedly not satisfying on our end, but being on the end of everyone else, it's logical. You're the person who stands in the way of humanity's futures several times. Also, if Factory makes the choice to save Robbie and keep Toriko, she's effectively wiped out all of humanity, and now has to just finish the job. If there's a chance of a third game, I'm curious where they'll take us, possibly in a branch ending in which we get the game based off the other ending of the first Void Terrarium, considering that neither ending was called the true ending like the second game, and we could see Robbie and Factory alongside a different and possibly reforming Cloud raise the first vestiges of the second coming of humans. Or we could continue off the actual true ending of the sequel, and find out that there are still some pockets of a diseased but ultimately curable humanity remaining, with Robbie and Factory deciding to maintain a biosphere or dome to keep the Terrarium motif, of course. But that's Void Terrarium. I love this series. It's admittedly a little difficult to get into if you're not willing to put in the time, but I highly recommend it. Such a beautiful story and such a beautiful game. But thanks for watching.